Let's begin. Thank you all for coming. And as usual, to remind you, we have agenda items. The Koch brothers' latest and greatest act, which we want to talk about in a little bit. Then the events that are really remarkable and historic in Greece and in Europe as an effect of what's happening in Greece. And then finally, something about the history of revolutions, because a number of you have asked me to do that, and it's probably more important than it's been in many a year to look at that again. But before we get to those three topics, a few short items, and I'm going to allow myself to tackle things which in the past I've thought might be too complicated or detailed, but we need to, and a few numbers won't hurt, I hope. So first, a few short items, one of which I simply had to address, was in the headlines today. It was announced that the Standard & Poor Corporation, and I'll tell you about them in a minute, has reached an agreement with the United States government to pay a fine of $1.37 billion, with a B, billion dollars for its misdeeds. They use other words, but they're all misdeed or softer. You can all imagine what that's about. This is the end of a long struggle between the government and Standard & Poor. When it began, they were to pay, the government demanded $3.5 billion. This was a compromise that got them off with less than half of that. What is this about? And it is so interesting and important that I want to spend just 5 minutes going over. What is Standard & Poor? What did it get in trouble for? Standard & Poor is a company that evaluates the riskiness of securities, stocks and bonds. So if you are an investor, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but if you are an investor and you invest large sums of money, before you decide which project to invest in, which bonds or stocks to buy, you might be nervous that you're going to buy something which turns out to be worthless. Unfortunately, just after you bought it, and then you're stuck. And it turns out that investors would prefer not to have this happen. And there is always, when there's a desire of somebody with money, capitalism is very good at immediately producing a response. Somebody will sell you something to overcome your anxiety. You all understand that from everyday advertising. Is it possible that you have body odor? Here are 500 companies that will help you with that problem if only you part with your money. So it's the same way in the world of investing. Standard & Poor's issues a rating. Some of you may have heard, or you read in the financial press, something is AAA rated. It has even come into the common language. That's actually where it comes from the rating assigned to the riskiness of an investment. It can be AAA, that's the least risky. Or it can be triple D minus, and that's a sign that you should run in the other direction rather than buy it. So everybody who, here comes the punchline, everybody who has something to sell in the way of stocks and bonds or investments of various clever kinds concocted in someone's basement while on illegal substance, anyone who's trying to sell that knows that he or she will have a problem because people will suspect they're being sold something worthless. How do you make it more attractive to the gullible, the investor? How do you do that? You do that by getting a very well-known rating company to say, hey, this is super unrisky, and go ahead and piss away your money. That was a joke. Go ahead and invest because it doesn't have much risk. So if you're a company, if you're a bank, for example, back in the 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, that era when banks were inventing new securities and marketing them, new collateralized debt obligations, default swaps, all kinds of clever things, as well as the traditional stocks and bonds. They were flooding the world with these new instruments about which investors were skeptical. So they cleverly got the idea, let's get a AAA rating. So they went to the famous rating companies. There are three who completely dominate. There are more than three, but these three completely dominate. Standard & Poor, that's the one who settled today, Moody's, M-O-O-D-Y-S, and Fitch. Fitch, Moody, Standard & Poor, that's it. Everybody else together is unimportant relative to them. They control the market. So if you want to show people that investing with you is not risky, you got to get one of those three. So if you're a banker selling these clever devices, you go to one of the three and you say, I'd like it to be rated. Now there's an ethical moment here. And when capitalism has ethical moments, hold on to your wallet. In this ethical moment, Standard & Poor's says, well, we could do a very careful study to just see how risky this is. And if we discovered it's somewhere in the middle, B, or B minus, or double B minus, that's the truth. But that bank will never bring us another security to rate, ever. They're going to go to Moody's, and they're going to go to Fitch, where they will get, how do I say this politely, a more gentle welcome. And the filter through which they evaluate riskiness will be, how shall I say, less harsh, more kindly. And the other one will give them a AAA, which is the best you can get. This will make Moody's, let's pick them as an example. I don't mean to pick on them, but I do enjoy it. Moody's will give them a good rating. Standard & Poor, in my little example, didn't. And Moody's has just won a customer. And as you can imagine, Standard & Poor's understands this real well and never makes that mistake. They give it a AAA themselves. A huge part, this is why they're in trouble with the government, a huge part of the collapse of our economy in 2008 occurred when it was suddenly made clear to investors around the world who had piled into all kinds of securities, but particularly a new kind called an asset-backed securities, which is a piece of paper that gives the investor a piece of 100 or 1,000 people's mortgages. The people who borrow money to buy a home, like some of you, you may not be aware of it, but when you do that little document, the bank takes it and keeps it for about 12 seconds. Then it sells it to a banker. And the banker puts them, a whole bunch of them together, and then sells to investors a security that gives the investor a piece of each of the 1,000 mortgages that they've clumpled together. You keep paying every month to the bank, thinking you're paying off your mortgage to who lent you the money. But the bank is just a holder, a clerk. That money is passed on to the investor. All over the world, in the United States and elsewhere, rich institutions, banks, insurance companies, wealthy people, corporations, piled into these things because they paid a high interest. And they were confident because they were AAA rated. So they bought them. And then when it turned out that these were mortgages of large numbers of Americans who couldn't pay their monthly mortgage anymore because they were unemployed, because they had borrowed too much money, because their wages were lowered, because they got sick, because they got divorced, 800 million reasons, people couldn't pay back. And when they couldn't pay back, this piece of paper that gave you a share of all these mortgages whose owners weren't paying back, your investment was now not worth much. And people got freaked out. Banks started not trusting each other because they didn't know if they lent to a bank across, we're talking the biggest ones. Chase lending to Citibank overnight, happens all the time. That stopped happening in the last months of 2008 because the hugest banks in the United States were not sure that that other bank could pay back tomorrow what you lent them today, because if they were owners of large numbers of those securities that were now worthless, they could and might have to declare defunctedness. That's a technical term. Okay? Defunctedness. And It was at that point that the American economic system came as close to collapsing as it has in 75 years. And it was all partly because of these absurd ratings that were a cozy arrangement between the banks and the other investors who were having stuff to sell and Standard & Poor's. So the bottom line is the government came in, and if you read the documents, they're wonderful. The government lays out, this was a conflict of interest which you resolved in an immoral, unethical, terrible way, and we're going to fine you. So they fined them, and and Attorney General Holder, a wonderfully moving statement, now they will know never to do this again because they had to pay a fine. So I did some research. The fine was $1.3 billion. I then added up the amount of money just Standard & Poor earned doing this kind of rating business since 2006. Because basically this is a fine for having misbehaved over that period of time. So it adds up to $17.7 billion. That's what they earned, and the punishment for that is $1.3 billion. Would you engage in a business that made you $17 billion if along the way you might get in trouble and you might lose a legal case, and if you did get in trouble and you did lose a legal case and you had the government after you, you'd end up paying 5 or 6% of what you earned over those 7 years. And I'm not counting all the money they earned before that, just since 2006. The answer is probably not. And here's the proof. The best year for doing this business on the part of Standard & Poor before the crisis hit was the year 2007, when they did $2.3 billion worth of this business. Last year, they did $2.3 billion worth of this business in 2007. This year, 2014, the last year for which we have data, they will do $2.4 billion. In other words, they will do more business last year after having been caught doing all of this, after having been charged with all of this, than they did before. Therefore, this is a wonderful example of what we used to call a crime that gets you a slap on the wrist. Only this is a very gentle tap so that the point is made in principle, and the point we're supposed to believe is that they won't do it again, and the joke is they're already doing it again. Therefore, it's a stunning mockery. This is a system that works this way. Everybody who's really savvy in the investment business, this is sort of the ultimate joke. Everybody knew that. This is not hot news. People in the investment business knew that if you have a rater who's paid by the person who brings him the thing to rate, there's a bit of a problem here that you might give them what they want, which is a high rating. No one ever came saying, oh, really give this a C. Never happened. They want a high one, and you'll keep the business if you give it to them. Everybody knew. But you know, this is a system. Everybody's buying these securities. Everybody's buying them hoping they can resell them at a higher price a month from now, a year from now. And all you need is to have someone else buy it at a higher price is that they're gullible like you. Why not buy something that is crazy if it's the system? And if you don't do it and your competitors do, they will realize the joy before it all falls apart. So if you've wondered, do these people kind of engage in something they know is crazy? And the answer is many of them know perfectly well. But they can't afford not to. That's what a system does. A system makes you behave in a way that conforms to the rules, the rewards and punishments of that system, even if you understand that won't end well. The name of the game is get out 1 minute before it collapses. There are people who have called this special game casino capitalism. That's what they had in their mind. This is like a casino. You know, if you know how a casino works, that the house always wins. The numbers are set up like that. But you kind of hope, in that desperate way people have, that you'll get the odd outcome before the house cashes in. The problem here is that the house is our economy and it'll cash in, and most of us will wonder what hit us.
Isn't it the same thing as buying legislation, this gambling routine?
In a way, because partly, you know, the obvious solution, I mean, you know, I don't have time to do, but the obvious solution would be to say, if we're going to have rating, the rating would have to be done independently of a buying-selling relationship between the one who wants it and the one who gives it, because buying and selling, this is going to come as a shock to you, but buying and selling can be a relationship that has, you ready? Awful results, which would mean that the market, what's what we mean by buying and selling, has awful results. And we live in a society where the market is as close to deity as we get. The market is a great institution. We're just watching a market produce results that are awful, that are catastrophic. And no one's going to do anything. No one. This is all charade. It's a theater that we're all supposed to take seriously, which even the people caught up in it know isn't serious. Yeah?
What's the politics behind this, behind the Justice Department is going after S&P? I can understand that if Obama was playing policeman for the good of the system as a whole, but he's not, obviously, from this money. So what's the why even bother going after them? Or if
you have to,
why not sink his teeth in?
The answer is you have to appear. You have to appear to be concerned and doing something, and at the same time, you can't really do anything because you're dependent, as you're going to see a little bit later today, from the very money that you cannot offend without kissing your political career goodbye. So you have to placate the ones who count with the money while appearing to the voter to be doing something, and you're watching that line being walked by Republicans. Obama isn't worse than the others. He does the same thing. Indeed, the next short item is to try to explain Obama. Obama in the last few weeks has been doing things that are remarkable. He's come out for some progressive tax changes. He's come out for some real help to the middle class, and he's proposed all kinds of things in his State of the Union message. Now in the budget he released a few days ago, it's sort of interesting. And I assume many of you have noticed this. Kind of, wow. Maybe some of you scratched your head and said, where was he the first 6 years of his administration? In those days, he actually had the Democratic control of one or both houses, and maybe he could have got some of this. He's coming out in favor of something which likely the Republicans won't let him do. And so you might think this is, I don't know, political theater. And what would the political theater be? Well, here's my guess for you to think about. When Obama wins, and he has a bit of an upsurge, and large numbers of people in this room, I would guess, and lots of other young people around the country went out and helped him win back in 2008. There was a lot of anger in the country. We were in the middle of this collapse of our economic system. The banks were out there exposed for what they had done. People were scared about where things were going. He might have moved in a way that a lot of the people who supported him had hoped for. And so the Republicans dug in and tried to scare who? The people who might be negatively affected if Obama went in that direction. Rich people's taxes might have gone up. Spending of the government might have shifted. Banks might have been subject to real reform of the sort that the Dodd-Frank bill is a pale gesture toward. And so the Republicans became, no, no, no. They appealed to the business community, support us to block him from doing anything like that. You do know that. You're watching it right now, as we'll see a little bit later this evening. You're watching Europe, led by Angela Merkel, do that to Syriza. Begin to, we're going to hold them back, we're going to stop them. A barrage that's extraordinary to watch as it plays out. It may succeed, we don't know, but it's being played to the hilt. So the Republicans and the business community got all excited, and they had to rally. That's what we're going to talk about with the Koch brothers. Koch? I don't know how you, Koch, sorry. The last thing on earth I would want to do is to mispronounce their names. Koch brothers. Interesting choice of pronunciation given our culture. But in any case, the Koch brothers as an example. So what is Obama doing? Well, he lost the last election. The House of Representatives as well as the Senate are now Republican. And basically, he's the opposition. I mean, he's in the presidency still, but he's in the reverse position now. So he's going to do what the Republicans did. He's going to say to the mass of people, oh my goodness, we've got Republicans. They're going to do awful things. They're going to make it terrible. And I'm going to stand. It's the same game. And he actually appeals to the same business interests because he says to them, and boy, is he saying it loud these days, you better go with us because we're going to handle this situation softly and we'll keep it going. Those crazy Republicans are going to take it too far and provoke a backlash. And that's not good for you business folks. So have a little progressivity with us Democrats to keep the whole thing under control. Don't go with those Republicans. They're pushing the situation too far. And that's a classic, that's how the Republicans and the Democrats play the game. When you're out, you figure out how to make a coalition of everybody who looks like they might be scared by whatever is coming in, what they might do, and you promise to be a little bit better than that. Not a lot better, but a bit better. And that's the choice, that or something a bit better. And the Republicans play the game in reverse, and we're watching this play out. Who knows what the consequences are, but it does strike me as mostly the theater that passes for politics. The third short item for today. This has to do with an article in the Wall Street Journal on the 3rd of February, yesterday, by Melissa Korn, K-O-R-N. I want to give her credit. And I was struck by this story. I don't know how many of you saw it. The story is about education, college education in the United States, and who goes to college and who graduates from college, and what that looks like. And the numbers, I found them so arresting, I wanted to share them very briefly with you because they seem to me to give an insight into what is going on in the United States and what we're moving towards that is remarkable and kind of stunning. Here's the story. A group of researchers, particularly in Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, asked the question, what percentage of people who come from the richest quarter of our population, the highest quarter income, what percentage of them go to school, finish college, by the time they're 24 have a BA degree, and compare that to the bottom quarter. So it's the same number of families, but you compare the richest family to the lowest family. And here's what the results are, and you can get them in the Wall Street Journal if you want, and there's a bit more detail than I have time for here. And these are numbers for 2013. They're the most recent for which the research could be done. 77% of young people from the richest quarter of our population, 77% have a bachelor's degree by the time they're 24 years of age. Bottom quarter, 9% of the people in the bottom quarter have a bachelor's degree by the time they're 24. 77% are getting college degrees from the richest, and 9% from the poorest. 1 in 5 of those from the poorest who go to college finish. 4 out of 5 drop out along the way. For the top, 99% of those who enter finish. Whoa, what are we learning here? We're learning that the education, the degree, is something clearly associated with the wealth, the income of your family. You have a degree because you come from the right place, and you don't have a degree because you don't come from the right place. You come from the poor place. Yet we pretend, don't we, that this is a society that's either committed to or based on, we only give you a job if you are qualified. Well, how would you get qualified? Mostly you have a degree or you don't. So we're basically saying qualified, but what we kind of mean is you come from the top, you get the job. You come from the low, you don't get the job. You're the one who's fired first, you're the one who's hired last. Do we help the people? A claim made by liberal folks a whole lot. Do we help the poor go to college? Well, these numbers suggest that whatever help we give isn't working real well. But let's look at the numbers. The most important grant the federal government gives to needy students is something called the Pell Grant System, P-E-L-L. And these numbers, and just hold them in your head, there aren't that many. In 1974, the average Pell Grant was $4,690, which covered roughly half tuition, room, and board that a student would have to go to. In 2012, the most recent numbers, the average money was $5,550. That's not a lot more. Meanwhile, the prices have gone crazy. So here's the wonderful result in the Wall Street Journal. The Pell Grant covered roughly half of a year's school in 1974. It covers 1/4 of the cost of a year now. The money that we give to the poor, the effect of it in terms of their college cost has dropped by half. Instead of paying half of it, it now pays 1/4 of it, which helps explain why either they can't get into the school or they can't stay in the school, since their financial troubles will be enough to throw them out. I want to say one more thing about the gross injustice of this. The gross injustice, because what we're doing is we are denying, that's what these numbers show, we are denying people in the lower half of the population one of the few ways they might get out of that dilemma, which is an education. This is not available to them, becoming harder for them to finance, not easier, that's what the numbers show, and so that we are cementing a difference not only of income, but a difference of income that is now compounded by a difference of qualification, which will be the most certain way to keep that differential and that inequality growing over time. That's why this points into a future that ought to scare you. But you know, even in college, and I spent my whole life being a professor at colleges and universities around the United States, and I still teach at the New School here even now, I've always been amazed and taken aback that American students don't object more to the grading system. I give a little speech at the beginning of every semester where I apologize to my class for grading. I explain to them that I am not here to determine whether you are a B potato or a C potato or an A potato. And I can't possibly evaluate your mental capabilities by reading a couple of things you wrote under duress in an exam situation when you hadn't digested your breakfast properly and your girlfriend had just said things to you that made your mind blow up. I'm now going to give you a grade as to how you performed. This makes no sense. And it has nothing to do with education. If you want me to educate you, then I have to read your writing over a period of time. We have to have conversations. I'll give you my opinions. They may or may not be you. That's it. That's a reasonable way to we don't do that. We give you these pressurized exercises and then write an A or a B or a C, and I apologize to the students. This is offensive. This is unfair. And I'm as honest as I know how, and I say to the students, I do this because I don't want to lose my job. They require us as professors to do this. So I'm going to do it, but I don't have to like it, and I don't have to approve of it. And then the students always raise their hand, and that's why I want to say the next thing. Well, then what is it really for? You hate it. We hate it. Why are we doing this? And I explain to them, the administration, it's a pain for them too. They have to keep all these records. Who cares? And the answer is, somewhere there has to be a reason for this. So I'm going to offer you one. Our system, our economic system, creates jobs mostly if enterprises think there's profit to be made by hiring a person to do something. In other words, we subordinate the employment decision, giving a person a job that he or she has been preparing for and studying for and likes to do, or whatever the motivations are. We give them a job if and only if it's profitable for somebody else to do that. And if it isn't, you don't have a job. You know, it has nothing to do with usefulness. A 10-minute walk out of the building here will show you 50 things that need to be done that could employ thousands of people. Clean the streets, rebuild the cities, have the daycare center. You know, we all know. It's easy. So clearly, we don't give people jobs because there's something useful to do. We don't give them jobs because nobody's making any money. So here's the problem. In our capitalist system, and this is really true now, it was always true, but it's true in spades now, there aren't enough jobs that are profitable. And this is a difficult thing. Why? How do you go to the American people and say, you know, we're terribly sorry to tell you that you're living in a capitalist system and you've got a lot of energy and a lot of creativity and you studied real hard and you're smart as a whip and you're fired. Or better yet, you're not even hired ever. You wanted to be a physicist? How about, I don't know, a barista? You can study how the steam goes through the coffee and write a paper for your grandmother. There aren't the jobs. And it's very hard. How do you explain it to people? If you explain it the way I'm doing it now, you're going to make critics of the system because you're saying you are all victims of a system that can easily identify loads of things to be done, but it can't work out getting you, who want a job, doing what we can all see needs to be done. So, because the system is so fundamentally irrational, you have no job. Have a nice day. The system can't do that. So the system has to work out a way, that the absence of work, either of any work at all, or of work that has any relationship to what you've been trained to do, or has any relationship to what you would love to do, and would capture your passion and your creativity. The inability of the system to provide that has to be explained to you in a way that doesn't make you anti-capitalist. And here's how we do that. Grades. No, I'm really serious. Grades. I give you an A. I give him a B. I give her a C. I give her an A plus, whatever I do, and it has a wonderful function. It means that employers who don't have enough jobs anyway will give it to the A's. And the beauty, the B's and the C's who don't get a job, this is the good part, will blame themselves. They weren't good enough. They didn't do studying enough. They took the wrong courses. They majored in the wrong topic. They buttered up the wrong professor. Whatever it was, they failed. And instead of being angry at the system, they'll go and have a lot of extra drinks because they feel bad about them. This is a technique for social survival, to have the victims of a system blame themselves. It really isn't very different from what feminists taught us some years ago, that if somebody attacks a young lady who has a tight blouse, the problem isn't the blouse and the lady, it's the problem of what's going on in the brain of the attacker. We're not without jobs because we got a B or we got a C. We're without jobs because there aren't enough jobs and somebody has to take the fall. You're it. You got a B and you're going to blame yourself.
What if you gave them all A's?
Yes. If I could get away with it, I would think about it. Okay, let's turn then, because we have to watch our time. Let's turn then to the topics that I wanted to spend. Oh, there is one more thing. I had to do this. This is a short one, but I just had to. The New York Times, on the 30th and 31st of January, just a few days ago, had two back-to-back stories, one on the 30th, one on the 31st, about the automobile industry. And because it is, for me, an emblematic discussion of the way this system works, but in a way that I want you to see the system nature of this, which is precisely the way these articles are not normally written, which is sort of the way I rethink them or represent them for you. The first article on the 30th was an article about car title loans. You might have skipped over that if that kind of headline is not what grabs you as you leaf through the paper. Car title loans. So let me tell you why this is an interesting topic. Here's how it works. You have an old clunker, but you have a problem, in that is you don't have enough money for an operation you need, for helping your child in some school problem, whatever. You're ill or whatever it is. And so you can now go, there's a whole bunch of companies all over the United States that specialize in this. You can go and you can borrow money. And the collateral you give is the title to your clunker. The title. And they'll give you some percentage of what their computer tells them that titled car, your 800-year-old Chevy or whatever it is, what it entitles you to. And here are the statistics about this. These loans last from 30 days to 2 years, everything in between. The top interest rate, which is what a lot of them charge, works out to 300% per year. So you've got people who need to do this. In 2013, 1.1 million Americans had this kind of a loan. 1.1 million in that year alone. 1 out of 6 of these people lost their car. That is, they could not make the payments over the 3 months or 3 weeks, and the company then takes the car as its security, as its collateral. 1 out of 6 do that. Wow. The most desperate poor people are ripped off, if they're lucky, for 300%, and if they can't make a payment, they've paid 300% and they lose their car, which, according to the story, is an explanation for why an increasing number of people can't get out of unemployment, because they now lack the car and they live in a place where there isn't the public transportation that will allow. I mean, it's like Job in the Bible. It's one plague or dilemma layered on top of the other. Second story the next day, also about cars. And it's about used car dealers. The writing in the story is wonderful. And for those of you interested in journalism, you've got to read these stories, because the gymnastics played by the journalist, probably unconsciously, to be able to tell this kind of a story without screaming with the horror of it is a skill. It's a skill to know how to pull. It's like certain people when they cook a chicken. When it's done, it tastes exactly like whatever it was wrapped in before you cooked it, you know, like nothing. This is journalism that, here's the story. It turns out that by law in the United States, a used car dealer is not required to tell you whether the car that is on the lot that you're looking at was a subject to a recall or not. It is also the law in the United States, according to the New York Times, that the used car dealer is not required to make the repair for which the recall was issued. For those of you who are not aware, the major car companies, the major American car companies and the major non-American car companies in the last 2 or 3 years have basically recalled all cars. Really, I mean, we're talking tens of millions of cars have been recalled for that ignition problem, for the belt problem, all kinds of problems that they've had. It's been a scandal. So if you're at a used car lot and you're looking at a used car, the chances that it was recalled for something wrong with it is super high. And the chances that anything was done about it are super low. You are buying, and by the way, you know how this became a story? People are in court who were killed by some of these defects in a used car they bought, and they want to sue somebody, and they're discovering. And in the Times story, there is legislation. It says in one line, there is legislation to fix this. But, and I quote now, it has languished in Congress. That's wonderful. It has languished. It lay back and looked at the sun. It languished. You know what that's a euphemism for? Somebody made sure that this doesn't happen. These are systemic problems. What would a reasonable society do? It would say if you're a poor person and you have an emergency, which is what the story says is leading people to go and do these car title loans, you'd have an agency that would say, if your income is below X and you need a short-term loan, there's a government agency will give you a short-term loan at the 2 or 3%, which would make it a profitable enterprise given current interest rates, not 300%. That would mean you wouldn't be gouging the people who can stand it least. They wouldn't fail to pay and therefore lose their car. It is so easy and obvious, it takes a lot of work to write an article which doesn't hint at anything like that. It's a sign of where the society is also going, that these stories are literally every day. I have a pick of them. You know, some of you that are journalists, Laura and others, you know, we have too much, not too little, to report on this sort of stuff. Okay, so let's turn then to the three topics, a bit longer, basic topic. The first one is the Koch brothers. So I want, first of all, to congratulate the Koch. I don't know them personally, but I congratulate the Koch brothers because of the story over the last week or two. I assume some of you saw it. They've gotten together with other similarly minded conservative business and wealthy people, and they've put together a fund. They're so proud of it, they publicized it, they've made it public. A fund of $889 million. That's a lot of money. $889 million, which they have committed to the 2016 election. So the election a year from now. We're at the beginning of 2015. They're gearing up early. So we're talking just shy of $1 billion. And if you start looking into this, you learn something. $1 billion is earmarked by the Koch brothers and their associates, both for the presidential and the congressional races of 2016. And that's in the same ballpark as what the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee are gearing up to spend. So I want to congratulate the Koch brothers. They've really reached a plateau. In this election, financially speaking, we will have a contest between the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Koch brothers. And they will be spending comparable amounts of money to do whatever it is they do. Now, it is the case that the Koch brothers are quite close with the Republican Party, certainly relative to the Democratic Party. So a Democrat might be forgiven for thinking this is ganging up. This is 2 to 1. We got Republicans in name, Republicans in another name, and then we have Democrats. And the Koch brothers are very sensitive about this. And they've indicated that they may support some Democrats, which leads one to wonder just which ones will fall first into the pool of money. Okay, I'm not going to bother you with the obvious, right? You all understand this is the purchasing of American political life. It's been going on a long time. This isn't new. It's a bit more brash. It's a bit more out there, and there's more money. But the money has been growing over years for a long. I mean, it goes up each year. So that really isn't all that interesting. I think what is worth pointing out, though, is the little bit of money that it is. I mean, think about it. We are a $15 to $16 trillion economy. And you can shape the basic political life of this society for $1 billion. That's if you can take $1 billion and shape what is done with 15 trillion, that's one of the best investments you'll ever be able to make. That's cheap. That's very, very cheap. A business class that wouldn't put this money forward, if it could stand to shape what's happening, would be the dumbest thing since, I don't know, Bozo the Clown. That's nothing. 1 billion to have a major influence on a government that spends 4 trillion, and on an economic system that is 15, 16, 17 trillion. Wow. It isn't just the best government money can buy. It's the cheapest buy you can imagine. It's wonderful. It's so cheap. The amazing thing isn't that our politicians sell out. The amazing thing is that they sell for so little. Where's their brains? What they've got to dish out is huge. They should ask for you, but they don't. One of the signs of the power of the ideology that keeps this system going is that it's so cheap to buy the political support. And one of the reasons it's cheap is that the opposition, us, are not powerful enough to make it much more costly. And that could change if the opposition understood the situation. It is, however, a historic moment, and so I'm not going to do that even though we're in a church, but we could have bowed our heads for a moment to acknowledge the boldness of the amount of money. All right. I want to turn next to what I know some of you have come for, which is a discussion of Greece. But we have some visitors here who are working closely with Syriza, so I want to ask those who are here to come up and say a few words. They asked to say something before we get into the conversation.
Come up and and no, he's going to sit. Anyway, I'm Michael Pelias. I'm a member of Syriza, New York, and also a professor of philosophy and a friend of Rick's. We're here to thank him on behalf of Syriza, New York, for his continual support, consistent support, and always putting Syriza first and foremost on economy update on the radio, as well as in this monthly meeting at Judson Church. And for most of you who don't know, Rick did lecture in Greece,
yes,
and actually had a former PASOK member as a student, not a great student, a C student, probably. And a former prime minister,
yes,
Yorgos
Papandreou.
Papandreou.
That's right.
So anyway, we want to give him a round of applause. We really thank you.
Thank you.
And there is coffee that is provided by Syriza outside. Katya is in the back there, all the way back. And anyway, Syriza New York has been very, very active in promoting, trying to get people to understand better what's going on in Europe and with Syriza.
Good.
And we are right now at the cusp of a tremendous historical moment. And
I'm going to talk about that.
And now Rick's going to talk about that.
Good. I might add to what was said by making a point. Some of you know that these monthly things have been going on for a few years, and they started at what was the Brecht Forum over on the West Side Highway some years ago. And back, I think it was in 2013, on a monthly evening, a friend of mine was in town, and we were going to get together and have a drink. And he said, because I had worked with him in the past a little bit, and he said, let's get a drink. I said, I can't because I'm going to be giving the monthly talk at the Brecht Forum. He said, well, what is that? I described it. And he said, well, let's do it together. So I brought him down. I don't know, anyone here there that night? Some of you were. His name is Yanis Varoufakis. And so he did this. He's now the finance minister of Greece. You read about him every day. But he was once standing in front of a room just like this, doing the monthly economic update like we are here. Indeed, I don't want to make more of this than I should, but indeed there's a number of my friends who are now very busy in Athens trying to figure out what to do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about it. First, underscore the historic nature. This is really important and very important for Americans. The election a week ago, Sunday, this election is absolutely historic, no matter what happens from now on. It can go in a lot of different directions, but independent of where it goes, something happened a week ago Sunday that everyone kind of has to have in their heads. The conventional political parties that had governed Greece in this case, who are very similar to the Republican and Democrat here, they alternated governments. The New Democracy, the Greek Socialist Party was their names, and they alternated for decades. Together they got 2/3, 3/4 of the vote in most elections. Greece is, of course, unusual by American standards. It's typical in Europe. They have, and I apologize for them for this, they don't have just two parties. They have a bunch of parties. You know, we in America understand that two is all you need. But in other countries, they think they ought to have, I don't know, you could call it freedom of choice. They want lots of parties. You know, the way we want when we go into the CVS, lots of toothpaste brands. We don't want just two. We want 27, one with green stripes, one with blue stripes, one with little blue dots in it. We want choice among toothpastes. Political parties, well, two's enough. The Greeks are not like that. So the two big parties get 2/3 of the vote, 3/4 of the vote, and the other parties share them. So the first big event is that the two parties who thought they had a lock on this, who thought that they would exchange government every 3, 4, 5 years in a musical chair kind of game, they don't together now get half of what they used to get. They're pushed out. That's amazing. Just imagine if the Republicans and Democrats together could barely get 1/3 of the vote. Where would the country be? Can you imagine? Well, you can now. You can imagine it much more because it just happened in Greece. Starting a couple years ago, 2012, with the change elections in Greece, the population began to say, you know something? This game of the two center-left, center-right, center-left, center-right, Republican, Democrat, Labor, Conservative, French Socialist Party, whatever the chaos of the right there produces, we don't want this anymore. It's unacceptable. A plague on both their houses, with a particular plague on the one who pretended to be the representative of the mass of people. So when the two went down, the Socialist Party really went down, because it was the one that claimed to be for everybody. And so the anger was particularly against them, and the defect. Many of the people in Syriza come from supporting PASOK or the Greek Socialist Party from before. So what's the political lesson? A left-wing party, unabashedly left-wing, hasn't hidden it, hasn't buried it, hasn't softened it, even though the newspapers are now working every day to suggest they're softening everything. The fact of the matter is they've been pretty clear and pretty consistent. A left-wing party pushed aside the two big parties and took their place. Wow. No one should imagine or underestimate what that means. The establishment in Europe, in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, in Italy, you name it, they didn't think that was possible. They didn't think right down to the end that this would happen. Even in the last days, they were convinced that they would have scared enough of the Greek people that they'd walk into that voting place and couldn't bring themselves to give another party, let alone a left-wing party, the power, which they did. And it's important that you all understand the way Greek politics works. They didn't just win. What they were able to achieve, 1 or 2 votes short of an absolute majority in their parliament, would be what we in America would call a mandate. Greek parties don't get that big a vote normally. This is this is not just a victory, this is a strong, powerful victory. They had to make a coalition with a little right-of-center party, but that party is tiny relative to them. This is like a coalition of the United States in a foreign war. 4,000 Americans and 11 Polish people. You know, that's kind of it's a coalition, but not really. This is a Syriza government. So that's a very important political breakthrough. And it helps explain the quasi-hysteria in European capitals ever since that day. People are stumbling all over her. Angela Merkel says one thing, her vice president says something else, the cabinet minister says something else, the French can't get it clear, the Italians are confused. The French political system, by the way, which is important, is interesting in one way. The most important upsurge in French politics right now is the right wing, the extreme right wing. The Le Pen movement, the nationalist front, the National Front in France. Now the father who set that up is now out of the scene. It's his daughter, Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen gave an unqualified endorsement of the Syriza victory, celebrated, went on French television and said, as the leader of the right wing in France, we celebrate and encourage and promise the support of the masses of the French people for the new Syriza government. Her statement was as strong as that of Mélenchon, who's the left-wing equivalent of her in French politics, and much, much weaker at this moment than she is. So the two extremes of French politics celebrated the Syriza. These are new things in European politics. Things are realigning. Things are moving. This is a sea change in consciousness. It really is a historic moment. Now, what are the Greeks going to have to do? Now, I'm put on my hat as an economist. The Greeks have a number of serious problems. I won't reiterate because we've done it before. The austerity program since 2010 has been savage in Greece, as bad or worse than anywhere else. You'd have to go to places like Spain or Portugal to get even roughly comparable. A huge number of unemployed, a drop in pensions, a drop in salaries, a drop in the minimum wage, just a long list of horrific crunchings down of the people. And I want to make real clear, because I've done the analysis with you before, and I just want to summarize it. Austerity is a program that says basically, capitalism really collapsed in 2008, 2009, really badly. And it requires the government to save it. So that the leaders of private capitalism, above all the banks, rush to the government, bail us out, which the government, without hesitation, did, to the tune not of billions, but of trillions. If you put together not just the deficit spending of the government, but also the financial supports, the loans from the central banks, the guarantees of the central banks, we're talking many trillions of dollars. And no sooner had they gotten them out of the worst of it, so we're now in 2010, then the very banks and others became nervous that they had lent money to the government to help finance all of the bailouts. They bailed themselves out by lending to the government. Now they wanted to make sure that that government paid them back. They didn't want any more government spending on anything else. They wanted the money that the governments had to be set aside, to be used to pay off those who had lent to the government the money that they used to bail out the banks. That's why they had to lay off workers. They didn't have the money to pay those people. They had to pay off their debts. In Greece, it's a particular circumstance, many of those debts had initially been the debts of the Greek government to private banks in Europe, above all French and German banks. After the crisis was immediately over, after everybody, including us and here in the United States, had bailed out our banks with endless amounts of money without a question raised, the Greeks looked at their situation and basically began to let the banks know, the French and German banks, who didn't need the Greeks to tell them, but they told them very politely, look, we need a lot more money because we're a little country and we're really being whacked by this crisis. You know, Greece is a tourist mecca. It's a place which is hurt when you have an economic downturn, and we had a doozy then, and Greece is terribly hurt. And we would like to borrow a lot of money, like every other government. And the lenders in the world said, well, you know, why should we lend to you? You're poor. You're deeply in debt. And besides which, the United States government is borrowing every nickel we have. We'll lend to the United States government. It's a much better deal. We're not going to lend to you. Or the nice way that bankers say that. We will, of course, lend to you, but you'll have to pay us an interest rate like this. Because if you don't pay us a high interest rate, we'll lend to governments that are much more reliable than you. The Greeks said, but we can't. We're dying here. We can't pay higher interest. But you have to. Well, then, if we can't, and you insist we do, there really is only one way out, isn't there? It's called default. You don't pay. By the way, just a footnote as we go through this. In every court, in every country on earth right now, there are dozens and dozens of cases where borrowers can't pay the lenders what they owe them. And the courts have an elaborate procedure for how to handle that, and it usually means the lender loses a little bit and the borrower loses a little bit, and they have a new deal. That's what you do. Bankruptcy is a way of handling that, and many other arrangements. So the notion that a borrower says, oh, I can't pay, is some earth-shaking new event, it's older than molasses. It's nothing. It's an everyday occurrence. And the Greeks had gotten themselves to the situation where they were saying to the French and German banks, we're not going to be able to pay you. At that point, a political crisis begins. Why? The French and German banks had lent a lot of money to the Greeks. That's another long story, but we don't have the time tonight. They had lent a lot of money to the Greek government. They were into the Greek government for a lot. And they had just come through the crisis of 2008, so they were very shaky, and they had gotten bailouts from their respective governments. When the Greeks became aware, and they became aware that Greece might not pay, the French and German banks faced an incredible problem. They would be in deep trouble if the Greeks didn't pay. Not because Greece has so much, but in that history, in that moment when they were vulnerable, this would have been very... And you know what the French and Greek banks would have had to do? They would have had to go back to their governments, Sarkozy in France and Merkel in Germany, and say to them, we're really sorry, but a year and a half after you gave us a bailout, we need another one. Sarkozy and Merkel couldn't do that, because they would be out of office in 2 weeks if they did that. Their people were so angry at the first bailout, so the banks had their governments right over the barrel. You've got to help us. And you can't make it a bailout because we know you'll lose the election, so you can't. How are you going to? They solved the problem. They bailed out Greece by getting European Union, European Central Bank, and International Monetary Fund. That's the money that the people of Europe provide through their governments. They gave that money to the Greek government, which used it to pay off the French and German banks, who thereby got their money back, didn't have to go to their government, and we in America were told, the Greeks have been bailed out. The Greeks weren't bailed out. The Greeks are suffering unemployment at a catastrophic rate. This is the first generation in quite some time in Greece of young people that are leaving the country in huge numbers because there's no work and no future. Kind of the worst thing that can happen, in a sense, to a society. You spend 20 years educating young Greek people at the expense of the Greek government, and then they go and work in England or France, delivering their productivity at the end of their education to the country that didn't pay for the education, just gets the benefit. It only makes the horror of the drain worse. So the debt the Greek government now has is to these European institutions, not to the private banks. That's what happened here. Meanwhile, the Greeks are savage. Why? Because in order to look prime minister-y, Mr. Sarkozy, unfortunately, had an election in the middle of this and got blown out by the French socialists, who said they were big anti-austerity. That was the way they ran their office. The socialists became the president, then took over the Senate, which they hadn't done in 50 years, and the National Assembly. So the socialists control everything in France, and immediately, having learned nothing from what happened in Greece with the PASOK, repeatedly betrayed their commitment to be anti-austerity and are now facing extinction in the manner of the Greek Socialist Party as well. Except in France, the anger about this has turned to the right, not to the left. Marine Le Pen is the banner carrier, not a Syriza type movement. Okay. Now, what is Greece going to have to do? It's back in the same situation it was. The ratio of its debts to its GDP is worse now than it was 3 or 4 years. The whole austerity that was supposed to get you out of this situation hasn't done so. It's a mess. And Greece is facing a situation with a left-wing movement that has promised to raise the minimum wage, to return the pensions, to put people back to work, to stop selling off the assets. So for those of you that were worried that the Parthenon would be known as the Dinsey Parth, a Disney Parth, which was a plan, and that you'd be able to swing from one pillar to another while Mickey Mouse handed you a hot dog, this is not going to happen. Okay? And the port of Piraeus will not be serving egg rolls the way they had planned, et cetera, et cetera. But the big problem for Greece, how are they going to do this? Well, one obvious thing is to not pay the debts, to declare now what they should have declared long ago, which is, we can't do this, and something has to be done. Again, remember, in every court, there's the borrower who comes and says, I can't, and then a deal is struck. By the way, a deal punishes the lender and the borrower. You know why? Because loans are made by a bank. A bank has what's called fiduciary responsibility. It is supposed to determine, since it typically lends other people's money, for example, we deposit money in a bank, it lends the money. It's lending other people's money. It is supposed to be responsible. It's not supposed to lend to somebody who can't pay back. And if they do, they've made a mistake for which they have to pay. You don't just make the borrower pay. This posturing, you must pay your debts. No, you don't. The norm in the world is you don't. You pay a portion of them. But let me finish. The Germans are leading the pack. You must pay, you must pay, you must pay. They had a partial write-down in 2010 or 12. They had a partial one there, but it's small, and their problem has gotten worse, not better as a result. So they're demanding, they've proposed basically half of the debt be wiped out, and the other half be stretched out over, say, 30 years. So that the amount of money they would have to come up with each year to pay this debt is small, so that they could take that money, instead of paying to the European Union, they could use the money to grow their economy, to put people back to work, to build up the incomes, in the hope that that could revive the Greek economy and make it possible, since the austerity that was supposed to be a successful policy was so unsuccessful that Greece is in a mess and their political situation has been transformed. So now the Germans arrive, not only them, the Finnish and others, saying, no, 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 you have to pay. So at this point, those of us who have had to learn economic history, whether we liked it or not, become aware that it's a moment for a little historical remembrance. So bear with me for 3 or 4 minutes while I take you back to the great year 1953. In 1953, what did we have? We had Germany devastated by World War II, the whole Nazi World War II story. Germany, which had also fought a World War I. And Germany teaches us a lesson. If you're going to be involved in a world war, the German lesson is it's much better to win than to lose. Germany lost twice. And one result of being defeated twice is that they were stuck with huge debts, which were debts to British, French, and American banks and governments, both private debt and public debt, we call that. Big debts. And the Germans were saying loudly, I'm going to now quote you because it's going to sound awfully like Syriza. They were saying, we can't recover from the war if we have to spend the little bit of money we have not rebuilding Germany, its railroads, its steel factories, its housing from the war, but we have to give you, the victors, all this money. This kind of argument, you know, didn't sound good in France or Britain or the United States because they were the victors in the war and they don't like this kind of talk. So the Germans came up with a better argument. We are just entering, they said, the Great Cold War with Russia. You want us, Germany, to be a grand ally, right on the front line, because remember, Germany is split between East and West, and we're right on the front line with the Soviet bloc, and we're going to be a big, but we can't if you make us pay the debts. We can't be, you see, you got to, woo, ah. Their politicians began meeting in London in February of 1953. They met all across the summer. These arguments were made. In August of 1953, they signed the London Agreement, it's called. What did the London Agreement do? You're going to love this. It erased 50% of the German debt, and it rescheduled the other 50% over 30 years. What the Greeks are asking for that the Germans refuse is what the Germans asked for and got.
That's right.
Oh goodness. What? No, it's really, this is not about this. The Marshall Plan is different. This was really just a way of helping, and again, it's normal. A country that can't function in the way you want it to, because it is, you know, in the early days of capitalism, people who were lenders, confronting that they had made a terrible mistake by lending to people who couldn't get back, felt very, very angry and righteous. And they took those people and put them in something called a debtor's prison. After a few months, they scratched their heads and said, you know, by putting that poor guy in a prison, the chances that he'll ever pay me back are poorer than if I wouldn't do that. So I may feel better that I punished the bad fellow, but I am shooting myself in the foot with this arrangement. So we got rid of debtors' prisons because it's much wiser to rebuild the capacity of the borrower to ever pay back some than it is to punish them in the misguided notion that that won't come back to hurt you. Lenders and buyers are part of a relationship. And if you destroy one pole, it's going to have ramifications on the other, even if you don't like to face it. So the Germans are now opposing with vigor what they themselves got not so long ago. And that's not a very good position. And that's not a very good political position to run forward with. And after all the posturing, and Greek politicians are posturing too, I don't mean to suggest that they're not playing a little bit of good cop, bad cop, and all the rest of it. In fact, watching sometimes Tsipras and Varoufakis, since I know Varoufakis, they must be having a good time at the end of the day, having an ouzo or 12 to get through the afternoon, but they're playing also. But you have to, because that's the way this all is being worked out. What is then my sort of conclusion from all of this? We are watching a classic struggle in which a status quo, which is the bulk of Europe, wants to contain, to minimize, and is trying to figure out how to do that. And they didn't expect to have to, and I don't think their strategies are very well worked out. Doesn't look that way to me as I watch and as I read. I don't know how well Syriza's strategies are worked out either. I'm not part of whoever makes those decisions. But at this point, it is a chaotic juggling of arguments and public statements to try to figure out what to do. For Syriza, they are in a remarkable position that is weak. I mean, they're a little poor country, but it's peculiarly strong too, because they are the beginning of what could become a much bigger problem for Europe. The only country that looks like it might go that road right now is Spain. But Spain is a very big and powerful economy, not like Greece. And Spain's debts to Europe are much, much larger than Greece's. And Spain is developing a movement, this Podemos movement, that is remarkable in how it's growing. The polls are now showing it in the upper 20s or low 30s in support, which is kind of the road Syriza took, and the same kind of numbers or orders of magnitude. And you can be sure that all strategies having to do with Greece have in mind to try to control and limit that this doesn't become a model, an inspiration, a beginning of something that will affect Spain, Portugal, right now, Ireland and Italy. Those are the countries most immediately affected by what is going on. And whatever Europe can do to control Greece, it cannot do if more than one Greece, let alone a big country like Spain or Italy, were to. Portugal and Ireland's a little different, but Spain or Italy are monsters in the European constellation, and therefore they would have a staggering effect. And Europeans have to try to control this. And the anger, particularly in Spain, is extraordinary. And because it may blow up between now and the next time we meet in our March meeting, I have to say a few words. There is a difference. The venom, there's no other word for it, the venom that is coming out in Spain is terrifying for me. You don't have, correct me if I'm wrong, the folks here from Greece, but you don't have a major politician in Greece who goes on the television and says about Tsipras what a major leader of the right wing in Spain said on television about Pablo Iglesias, who's the leader of the Podemos. And he said on television with a snarl, somebody ought to put a bullet in the back of his head. Wow. And that's not unusual. In the Spanish parliament over the last 2 or 3 years, when the government announced cutbacks in welfare and cutback, you had large, I saw it in television, you had large numbers of the right-wing delegates who are dominant in the Congress stand up and cheer. For Americans, it's Mitt Romney's mistake in that meeting that he got caught at, you know, where half the Americans are moochers who live off, half of us work hard and the other half just live off the 47%, exactly, the 40. And even Romney didn't say it with, let's go, kill them. But in Spain, it is what? Very hard not to think of Franco and the history of Spain, of the Civil War, and all of the pain that comes out of any civil war that is now finding its way up into a split between right and left that is terrible to watch. And as the politicians struggle, also in Germany, also in Finland and other places, things are surfacing that are signs of a society and of a social system that's in extreme distress. For the Germans with their history, my mother was born in Berlin. My first language is German. I feel part of that culture. I was born in the United States and I'm an American, but German is part of what I am and I'm happy about it. But for the German people and their leader to work out a political strategy that has them encouraging German people to think of Southern Europeans as lazy, as not working, as somehow deserving of a different way of being handled as people from Northern Germany, whoa, that is a very dangerous game for that culture with its history to go anywhere near. And for a politician who's smart, and Merkel is, this must be a sign of, whoa, have I got problems. There's austerity in Germany. The German working class is not happy with its situation. It has prided itself on being better off than the Southern Europeans. Not the least little factoid. If Syriza raises the minimum wage, I believe to the level of 750 euros a month, it will mean that the German working class that is working on part-time contracts will earn less than that, large numbers of them. And that's going to be very difficult to understand and to process. So we're going to be watching, and I will be coming back in March to talk about what has played out. What games are being played here? Will they try to starve Greece? Will the Europeans who are afraid try to make Syriza fail, break down, be unable to do anything in the hope that for the rest of Europe, then this looks like a direction you can't take, that it's a path that doesn't work, that it's a solution? Very dangerous game, because what would then Syriza have to do? If you're not going to get relieved by your external debt in order to deliver on your promises, and if you can't go back because the Greek Socialist Party shows you what happens if you betray all that, then the only thing left is to solve the problem of Greece by what? By going after the Greek wealth and changing that society. There are forces in Greece, in Syriza, that have spoken like that. There are forces in Greece that do not want to do that, and that fight is being held, has been and continues in that party, because relatively open to its different directions. But the danger of Europe is you don't give them a way out, you may be sorry where you force them to go.
They might go to Russia.
Yes, yes, they are going to talk to Russia about the UK. All right, very quickly, because I don't have much time. Pay attention, it's worth it. We are part, by luck or happenstance, of a historic shift, and the ramifications are everywhere, including here in the United States. Right? Here in Greece, Syriza means alliance or coalition of left, coalition of people on the left, on the radical left. Well, it tells us then that, wow, look what you can do if a lot of disparate groups on the radical left make a coalition and have an organization and become political. My goodness, this might occur to Americans. Imagine that. And it might occur to them that if we did that, maybe we could have something like that, at least as a possibility, rather than assuming, as so many do, that it's impossible. Look, I have come to a time when I have promised the church and others that we will stop. I was going to do, and let me tell you, I'll tease you with it, we'll do it next month. A number of you have asked me, in the history of revolutions, whether it's been the revolution against slavery in other parts of the world, in the United States with the Civil War and all that, or the revolution against feudalism, the French Revolution, or the revolution against capitalism that we thought might be happening in 1917 in Russia or 1949 in China, that these revolutions, on the one hand, moved society forward, but on the other hand, never achieved the freedom in whose name they were made. You have to somehow understand what they did achieve and appreciate that, and yet also be critical and answer the question, why didn't they? Because the critics and the skeptics of revolution always remind us of what they didn't achieve, partly as an argument about why not to go that way. So if we don't have an answer, if we don't have an explanation, we can't pretend that they were the end of everything, because the mass of people clearly don't believe that. And I think most of us probably don't either. So we have to have an explanation. That's what I want. I want to talk about what it was these revolutions achieved and what it was they didn't achieve, so that I can offer you an explanation of what they didn't achieve, because I think if we have that clear, then the next effort, wherever and whenever that is, will be better, more likely to succeed, because it has figured out what went wrong in those other ones, which doesn't deny what they did achieve and what progress they did make, but asks the hard question about why they couldn't go further. And I am going to do that with you next month. So you've been very patient. Thank you very, very much. And I hope to see you next week.